Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to yet another edition of Truth to Power. My name is Herbst Patel. I will be in your company for the next 1 hour. Well, in the second half hour, we'll be talking to Herbst. He's the Netgear 911 national spokesperson, just to get an idea how the ambulances are doing during these difficult COVID-19 periods. Of course, they are one of those who are going to be very active and are within the frontline workers to help those during the COVID-19 pandemic. But my first half an hour is an important guest, somebody who is not new to South Africans, of course. He is a man who was one of the pioneer finance ministers in our country. It is none other than Mr. Trevor Manuel. Good afternoon, Mr. Manuel, and thank you so much for joining us on Truth to Power on ITV Networks.
Assalamu alaikum, Faraz, and thank you for the opportunity.
No, wa alaikum salam. It's an absolute pleasure to have you. Mr. Manuel, of course, we've got so much to talk about with regards to our half-an-hour discussion. But before I go into it, Mr. Manuel, of course, this week we saw the tragic passing away of Winnie Mandela, somebody, of course, you know very well. The father and the mother, the late father and the mother, are two people that you know very well. Just give us your experiences that you had with the late Winnie Mandela and, of course, her role that she played in fighting the apartheid government.
Well, you know, the family has always been very precious to us. Apart from Zinzi, sister Zenani, older sister Zenani has always been there. And I think we all related to the family in different ways. To me, growing up in Cape Town, even in these circumstances, when Zinzi came to visit her dad on the island from the time she could, we would connect with her and we were very proud. We always looked up to her. And then as she became a bit older and capable of articulating a voice in 1985, when P.W. Botha had offered Madiba conditional release from prison, it was the family that asked Zinzi to address a rally at Jabulani Stadium in Soweto, where she read the letter from her father. And that made the representative of the family in oh so many ways. And bear in mind that life was quite tough because her father was in prison. The mother was taken away from her repeatedly, kept in prison for very long periods, put under house arrest. Even at the time when Zinzi addressed that rally, her mom was in banishment in the Free State. It was a very, very tough growing up, you know. But notwithstanding that, Zinzi had a fearlessness and the ability to articulate, but she didn't ride on the coattails of her parents. I think that what was very important to her was to be able to stand up in her own name and right and speak in her own name and right, not just as a child of Utata and Mam Winnie, but as Zinzi herself. And she was very strong on a range of issues, very strong, certainly on the need for those who benefited from apartheid to absolve themselves of responsibility by taking responsibility for what had gone on in the country. And that was Zinzi, and it came as a bit of a shock on Monday when we learned that she passed away much too young at the age of 59. But may her soul rest in peace.
May her soul definitely rest in peace. Of course, she was buried earlier on today. Mr. Manuel, let's go, of course, to our topics of discussion. You, of course, were appointed as part of the AU Envoy that was developed by President Cyril Ramaphosa. So we just want to get an idea of your role and, of course, your experience as a finance minister in trying to get the help necessary to have an economic plan for the continent of Africa, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you very much, Faraz. The President Ramaphosa, in his capacity as chair of the AU Commission, had appointed a few of us as envoys, and envoy is a fancy title for unpaid lobbyists. And so a few of us, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala was the Minister of Finance in Nigeria. Donald Kaberuka was the Minister of Finance in Rwanda. Abdurrahman Ben Khalfa, who was the Minister of Finance in Algeria, Tidjane Tian, who was a businessman largely in Europe. We were the envoys, and we were deployed to do a few things. The first issue is to try and deal with debt service from the African continent. Now, as I speak to you, Faraz, about 35 billion US dollars flows off the continent as debt service costs annually now. The bulk of this is about 22 billion of this actually is to bilateral countries that have lent to African countries, and the remainder would be to the World Bank and IMF. And part of what we've done, and we think that we've been able to get an agreement, is to win a reprieve of 2 years of debt service without that amount then being capitalized later. 2 years would mean that we can retain 70 billion, give or take, on the continent to be able to help countries get through the COVID crisis. We've got agreement from the World Bank, the IMF, and the G20, and this is now, but it's, the agreement is at a general level. Bear in mind that every country had borrowed in own name and right, and so you have to dot the I's and cross the T's and do a bit of hand-holding, and also ensure that we can get private sector lenders across the line in the same way. Then there's also an ongoing platform which is being run by a Zimbabwean, a man called Trevor, and he's put together a platform that will allow countries on the continent to purchase what is required to deal with COVID, from personal protective equipment to medical supplies to test kits. And just last week, heads of state in the African Union had agreed that we can now start also with therapeutic medicines as and when they're available. And so he's been able to put together a platform where countries would apply on a monthly basis to acquire these things. Payment is made, and the task of the platform is actually to secure these goods at the lowest possible cost, and it's working. There are about 22 countries that have signed up, and then behind that, an enormous program to ensure that the logistics of bringing goods. Initially, it was just going to be imports from China, but across the world, a number of countries have actually raised the hands of their companies because they want to be part of this. So it's the logistics of getting this through. But in this program as well, there are a number of medications and also equipment that can be supplied by South Africa. And so on the African continent, South Africa is actually the only supplier that can deal with a range of issues. And you may be aware that in respect of ventilators, for instance, there's been a lot of design and now the building. And so this can be supplied to the continent from South Africa. But this is part of what we're doing. There's also ongoing work in relation to special drawing rights, which it's owned by primarily the wealthier countries. And we'd like them to convert that into cash so that there's a ready stream of money to help not just in the immediacy of COVID-19, but also to rebuild countries going forward. We've attached a lot of importance to what happens in countries. Some of the things that we talk about here, most countries actually don't have a social safety net. And across the continent, most people who work are actually, they earn on a daily basis, and so there's no support for them. We're also hoping that countries will be able to provide some debt guarantees for businesses in the respective countries. So this is the work that the envoys are doing, and it's ongoing work to ensure that we have a solid and single African voice as we proceed along this path.
Mr. Manuel, let's come home. Our economy is going through one of its most difficult periods at this moment. Just a few weeks ago, another contraction had occurred, and of course there was the 500 billion rand stimulus package that was announced by Minister of Finance Tito Mboweni and President Cyril Ramaphosa. How does Treasury and South Africa go ahead and rebuild the South African economy post-COVID-19?
Look, it's a fairly difficult issue at one level, and everybody's looking for hard economic solutions. I think that the rebuilding is actually about something else. It's actually about the way in which leadership plays its role in South Africa, and I'm hoping that it will be leadership that brings all the parts of South African society together. We want to have, or we need business, government, trade unions and community organizations together. And that leadership needs to be strong enough to look beyond the immediacy of these various parts that want to take things off the table for themselves. Part of what we're seeing in South Africa at the moment is every grouping, if it's not the taxi drivers or the taverners or this part of business or that part of business, wants government to give them. I don't know where government is going to get it. But we need an all-in effort that'll be targeted about what needs to be done, when it needs to be done. It needs to also involve actions by all parties across South Africa, and we need to place an emphasis on inclusive growth. I think that we've seen just last week, the Business for South Africa released a detailed report that says that the rebuilding to get South Africa back to 4% growth would cost in the order of 3.4 trillion rand. The bulk of it has to come from government, but at least 1 trillion rand has to come from business as well. It's going to be about infrastructure, it's going to be about jobs, and it's going to require that we attend to the issues that we haven't been good at, such as bringing small and medium businesses into play and ensuring that the ownership patterns in this economy change for all time. We need to consider those issues now and not after everything has been done in respect of COVID. There are a number of sectors where we need to be doing a lot more right now, including green energy, securing the energy supply, rebuilding roads and water supply and those kinds of things. And I think that there's a fair amount on the table to bring in small and medium businesses. What is necessary is leadership to ensure that all of us as South Africans understand that we're in this for the long term. Short-termism, including trying to take money off the table, is not going to help us at all. We also need from government a very firm hand to ensure that no part of corruption or maladministration is tolerated. These are the kinds of messages that will say to everybody that we're in this together, we've got to take the tough decisions, and we've got to walk this journey together. I think it's those kinds of issues. At the same time, I think that there needs to be an emphasis on building a capable state so that the public servants who are there don't take decisions that we're going to rule later because they weren't well considered. This idea of a big sum of money, and it's borrowed money, there's been the agreement signed with the new development bank, the so-called BRICS Bank, which is based in Shanghai. There's a negotiation ongoing now with the IMF to also borrow, but I think there aren't any gifts. This money is borrowed, and borrowed money needs to be paid back. And as Minister of Finance Tito Mboweni said in his adjusted budget a few weeks ago, part of our problem is going into COVID, 21 cents in every rand of taxes raised goes to debt service costs. At the end of the process, when we have to repay whatever we've borrowed now, there's less available. And as we borrow excessively, it means that we less, as a country, are less capable of dealing with public services. And so when we look at public services, we look at schools and clinics and hospitals and roads and water supply and so on. And there is a division in this country, and people who can afford it end up in private hospitals, send their children to private schools. But for the majority of South Africans, that is not an option. And if you're spending on the past more than you are on the future, then I think you cut off people who've been trapped in apartheid. You cut off those people and their children from the future because you under-resource the very necessary public services.
Mr. Manuel, and then, talking about the supplementary budget speech, Minister Tito Mboweni spoke about zero-based budgeting. Now, until I heard about zero-based budgeting, this was a completely foreign phrase that he had used. Somebody that sat in Treasury like yourself, Mr. Manuel, can you give the viewers an idea of what is zero-based budgeting and how this could play a significant role in trying to at least put us in good stead during this difficult time of COVID-19?
For us, we had to do zero-based budgeting when I got to the Treasury in '96, because we couldn't live off the way in which apartheid had budgeted, because they had budgeted for inequality, for racial inequality, and part of what we needed to do was to ensure that we could allocate resources differently. At that point, we were also building 9 provinces, quite new, and needed to allocate resources quite differently. And then what had also happened was that the deficit was very high, and we were at a similar point where our debt service costs were too high. And Madiba, whose birthday we'll celebrate tomorrow, said to me, we can't be spending more on the past than the future. Education is our future, and we must spend more on education than on debt service costs. So that, I think, became an important measure for us, and we had to take some tough decisions. But what we needed to do was to say to every department, bring what you want and what you're spending on. And we had to, as the Treasury, we had to compare so that we could remove from their budgets programs that couldn't be justified. And part of the problem right now is the very high costs of the public service wage bill. Now, what you're going to find in there is that there are many ghost workers in the public service, people who are being remunerated who can't be found. You've got to take them out. You've got to ensure that there's pay for work. And I know the minister's taken a very hard decision, and this decision on no automatic increases is being challenged by the public sector unions. But I think we must support him in this thing, because it's a very tough issue. Because if the only thing we do is collect taxes so we can pay the public sector workers who may or may not be very productive. Right now, we're seeing that many public sector health workers are exceedingly productive. They're putting their lives on the line, but there are others who are hiding. And I think it must be productivity-based. And then I think as South African taxpayers, we don't mind. But these are the big battles. But every department has to demonstrate that those programs that are there, and these programs are frequently the things that are the power games in departments. So ministers don't know about it. In fact, what we had to resort to doing in the early stages of my tenure as finance minister, ministers had to come and say, I have been through my budget with my department. And we had a ministers' committee on the budget who were very well geared and prepared for this kind of thing. And then we would have a peer review. And we would inform ministers what we were taking away from them. And it was always very difficult, because those ministers who had money taken away had to go back into their departments and persuade their officials that they understood what the decisions were about. But you actually need very strong leadership in government, and we were fortunate during that period. We had Madiba, and then we had Thabo Mbeki. And they actually helped us deal with this issue, and they were present, and they supported us. And I always took a view that I could take tough decisions as a Minister of Finance because I had the support of my colleagues, but more importantly, I had a lot of air cover provided by presidents. And I think it's the same issues that have to arise now. The difficulty, I think, is President Ramaphosa is caught. He's president of the AU at the moment. I heard just this morning with a breakdown in talks between Egypt and Ethiopia. President Ramaphosa actually has to mediate those talks on the Renaissance Dam or the Millennium Dam. And he's got to take those responsibilities in addition to trying to run government in the period of lockdown. It's very, very tough. But I think, again, we must raise our hands and say, go for it. We need to back you. You must get to zero-based budgeting. You have to turn this thing inside out and ensure that every rand that is raised by way of taxes goes much further.
Mr. Manuel, let's talk about small and medium business enterprises and, of course, the informal sector, because this is a sector within the economy that really does contribute a lot. So the importance of rebuilding this enterprise or this sort of part of the economy, especially during COVID-19, where these businesses have been affected due to the lockdown. I think both you and I can agree that the lockdown was necessary to save the lives of many South Africans, and especially during the peak of the virus that we are going through now. So how important will small and medium business enterprises be and the informal sector in helping to rebuild the economy?
I think that small and medium businesses are going to be fundamentally and increasingly important as we go forward. And this is why I'm saying we've got to plead with government to be smart about how they engage with these issues. Firstly, I think that there needs to be a determined effort to bring small and medium businesses off the margins. And sometimes the voice of larger businesses is so incredibly strong. I bumped into a chap last Sunday who told me that for 2 years he's been deep cleansing buildings and so on. And he was doing reasonably well. Now these large companies have come in. They have the power of marketing, and he is struggling to put food on the table. When in fact, given the fact that COVID frequently means buildings must be shut down, should be giving him an opportunity to do things differently. Somehow there needs to be a voice of business. So that's the one side. The other side is, and this is a battle that I recall from my tenure as Minister of Finance, which ended more than 11 years ago. Government doesn't pay small and medium businesses. And there has to be, in fact, there is a rule that requires of them to be paid within 30 days, but frequently this doesn't happen, and small businesses don't have the cash flow. And so when government starts out giving them work and then doesn't pay them, it forces them to shut down. These are issues not just for government, but larger businesses. Engaging small businesses have to do this as well. And I'm hoping that we can drive these issues quite hard. The third issue is to bring small and medium businesses off the margins, and there are a number of opportunities. It may start out in subcontracting, in manufacturing or construction or so on, but needs to support businesses moving from small to medium. That's frequently a big change, and then from medium to slightly larger. Because what we call small business in South Africa is frequently survival activities. And I think that when people go out day after day through the cold and the rain or the sun to sit on a street corner and sell a few items to put bread on the table, we've got to admire them, but I think we must say at the same time that they need to be supported. And I think the big issue is that government must come to the party. And these officials who ill-treat small businesses, I think there must be consequences for their behavior. We talk about it, but we don't act against people who actually undermine small businesses. And I do think that one of the issues that has happened in the language in South Africa is that we confuse broad-based Black economic empowerment with small business. And there's a place for each of them. But you can't collapse everything together. There's a place for each of them, but small and medium businesses need to be supported in their name and right. And sometimes these are businesses intergenerational that need to survive, that must be recognized as important players. And then I think the exchange on that is also that businesses must then recognize, if government supports them, that they need to also do what is required of them. They need to pay their taxes and they need to play fair. And that's how societies are transformed. If we keep trying to hide from each other, you don't transform society, and that I think is something that we also have to put into this. But I think, if anything, the small and medium business sector needs a lot of care and attention during the period of the lockdown, and as we emerge from it, so that it can flourish in South Africa.
And long may the small and medium business enterprises thrive, and of course the informal sector. Mr. Manuel, our state-owned enterprises have gone through a lot of difficulties, especially during the last decade. They haven't been profitable. There have been retrenchments. There have been bailouts that government has had to give to the state-owned enterprises. So the question is, what needs to be done first in order to get it profitable, but also in terms of trust and accountability from its citizens? Because at the end of the day, these state-owned enterprises are looked at as the citizens, and it is looked at as this is something by the state, for the state, but it is also something for us. So how do we get trust and accountability, but most importantly, the profitability of the state-owned enterprises?
For us, the interesting issue for me is I don't actually remember having to dig into the budget to support small and medium enterprises in the 13 years, state-owned enterprises in the 13 years I was Minister of Finance. We ensured that the strength of their balance sheets allowed them to conduct their own affairs. It wasn't so much profit, because each of these, the key state-owned enterprises, has an important developmental mandate. So if you ask about Eskom must be able to provide electricity, low-cost electricity to all South Africans. It must ensure that it's an uninterrupted supply of electricity, and it must do so from what it's capable of borrowing against the strength of its own balance sheet, and against the strength of what it can raise by way of tariffs. Similarly, Transnet's primary function would include freight rail, ports, harbors, and then you need to bring in PRASA as passenger rail, and Shosholoza mail, and those kinds of things. And Transnet used to also wash its own face. It wasn't the emphasis on profit. It's about delivering a service and understanding that unless you've got a transportation logistics frame that serves the country, you can't get economic growth going. And so you can run through the entire list of state-owned enterprises. I mean, I look at SAA now, and look at the deep tragedy, and look at the debate that took place just this week about business rescue and so on. And when I look at the state of our state-owned enterprises, the depth of the tragedy of the 10 years or so of Jacob Zuma strikes one. It strikes you in the solar plexus, and you understand just how devastating it's been. You understand the role of the Guptas and so on, how devastating it's been. Because, once you've got state-owned enterprises with its own credit rating. In fact, when I became finance minister, Eskom had a stronger credit rating than the country had. Today, it is overborrowed, it is depleted, and it's a few years within that past decade, a few years within it, of rampant corruption that has now destroyed the ability of Eskom to supply electricity, to supply uninterrupted electricity, and to supply electricity. We used to be the world's lowest cost producer. And all of that has changed, and you don't just get it back because you're not entitled to it. You have to work at these issues on a continuing basis. And unless the state-owned enterprises are supported to achieve this, and it's complex because you've got chief executives, they've got boards, they've got a department over them, they have to go to parliament, sometimes to the line function portfolio committee, sometimes to the standing committee on public accounts, SCOPA. There are too many reporting lines, but actually it's about the performance of these state-owned enterprises. And you must understand that they exist people will tell you sometimes that some of these things would be better done by the private sector, but nobody in the private sector is stepping up to take over Eskom, to take over Transnet, to take over SAA, etc. And therefore, it's fundamentally important that there be the reordering of what they do. We need managers in those state-owned enterprises who are competent, and we need boards who are going to be vigilant in the governance of the state-owned enterprises. And I think that becomes a primary focus for us. I know that there's debate right now about SAA, 10.5 billion rand to start with. But you're paying that 10.5 billion rand in an environment where planes are not flying, where there's no payload, where once payload comes back, you need to ensure that there are people on those planes. You need to ensure that your prices will at least be able to ensure that SAA can remain as a going concern. And that, I think, is a long way off. So the way in which these decisions are taken needs to also be mindful of the resource constraints in the country, because if you take that 10.5 billion for an SAA, you're taking it away from somewhere else. And so those discussions, I think, are fundamentally important, and the cabinet must be seen to lead us on these issues.
Mr. Manuel, one final question before I let you go. You mentioned tomorrow it would have been the 102nd birthday of Tata Madiba. This is somebody that you know very well. He wasn't just a colleague of yours, but he was also a dear friend. Just share to the viewer some of your best memories, or the one memory that stands out that you had with the late and great Nelson Mandela.
For us, I think that for me, one of the big privileges in life was to have been there, certainly. From the time he walked out of Victor Verster prison in Paarl, I was there. I looked after him for the time he was in Cape Town. Soon thereafter, he called me to Joburg to be part of his first international trip abroad. It was fascinating because we also met Oliver Tambo in Sweden, but we'd been through the African continent by the time we got to Sweden. That was fantastic. And then when he told me that I must head the Department of Economic Planning in the ANC, I was a bit shocked because I didn't know too much economics at the time. And later when he invited me to serve in his cabinet, it was interesting because he was, as the president, he was my boss, he was my political leader, but he was also, in some respects, a father who I didn't have. Sometimes he would talk to me as a father talks to a son. And that was a very, very rare relationship. I couldn't take advantage of it, nor could he or did he. But it was a very, very special relationship that allowed us, because of age and his experience and the immense respect I've always had for Madiba, to be able to work together in that unique relationship. And he was smart beyond years, He didn't want to put me into the frying pan of being finance minister right in the beginning. And it was 2 years, in fact, some time before that, when he asked me to watch carefully what the finance minister did, so that at the appropriate time he could appoint me. He gave me his trust, he gave me the support, and he gave me the leg up. And I think it's as a function of my relationship with Madiba, that I saw the most incredible opportunities that anybody in this country could have, given where I come from in poverty and raised by a single mother who just passed away recently. Madiba was very, very important in my life in providing me with those opportunities. So it's a matter deep in the heart of a relationship that was very, very special.
Mr. Manuel, and of course our condolences to you and your family on the passing away of your mother. May the Lord make this difficult time easy for you and the rest of your family.
Shukran. But let me just say for us, let me just use the opportunity, and I use it as we mourn the passing of Zinzi. My mother died at the age of 94 from COVID-19.
Wow, okay.
Now, I said this at her funeral because I fervently believe that all of us have the duty to take responsibility for our actions and ensure that that the disease doesn't spread. This disease doesn't happen to other people. It's happening increasingly to people we know. The virus strikes people down, and all of us have a responsibility to ourselves, to our families, to everybody we love, and to society, because we can't lose skills in this society, to ensure that we act responsibly, understanding that this virus doesn't draw the line outside our homes or outside our village, our country. It is virulent, and it will take us down if we're not careful. Thank you very much.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, and you couldn't have put it any better. The former Minister of Finance, Mr. Trevor Manuel, we thank you so much for the opportunity that you have given us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to you.
Wa alaikum salam.
There we go. Mr. Trevor Manuel, he was, of course, the former Minister of Finance and one of the great economic thinkers of our country. He's currently heading the AU Envoy for President Cyril Ramaphosa to help the continent of Africa during these difficult times. Well, coming after the break, I will be speaking to Sean Herbst. He is the National Netgear 911 spokesperson, just to get an idea of how our frontline workers are doing during this pandemic. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Truth to Power. Now, our frontline healthcare workers are facing some of the biggest challenges that are currently affecting our health system at this very moment. And joining me on the line to discuss how our health workers and frontline workers are striving to deal with these challenges, I have Sean Herbst. He is the National Netgear 911 spokesperson. Sean, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Sean, let's just give an idea to our viewers the challenges the frontline workers face. And these frontline workers are none other than the ambulances who have to attend not only to the COVID-19 cases, but other serious cases that are going on in the country right now.
Correct. I think with level, it's going to be on level 3 lockdown, the amount of trauma cases and the violent cases that we are seeing has diminished quite a lot. I think one of the largest, not problems, but issues that we face with at the moment is the sheer volume of patients that we're dealing with at the moment. Most of them COVID-19 positive patients.
And Sean, let's just give an idea of what happens in an ambulance, because I'm sure now ambulances have had to change the way they do things, especially now getting ventilators and, of course, social distancing. But it's very difficult to have social distancing in ambulance. So how has the Netgear 911 brand gone ahead and made sure that some sort of social distancing can be achieved, especially now with Gauteng as a province being the peak?
Correct. Well, all our staff have been provided with the most comprehensive range of PPE. They're completely covered from head to toe. Obviously, inside an ambulance, social distancing is a bit more complicated. Where possible, we will try and give our patients the appropriate PPE to protect themselves and to protect the paramedics at the back of the ambulance.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be very, very important, making sure that the appropriate PPE is given to the frontline workers. And talking about the frontline workers, because they are right now our heroes and our heroines in this challenge. So, you deal with them on a daily basis. Talk to us about the psychological effects that they have right now and how they have to put on a brave face to make sure that we as the citizens are not emotionally okay, but at the same time physically okay.
Correct. All our staff do go for counselling if they require it. I'd say most of the staff are in a very good mood, all uplifted, feeling good, positive about everything. I think everyone wants to just see the COVID-19 pandemic through it.
And I think that's all everyone wants, to make sure that the COVID-19 pandemic is gone, but it may be here for a very, very long time. I know in the hospitals, this is something that you do not deal with, but there's been an overwhelming of the hospitals. So How does, ambulances and Netgear 911 work to make sure that they can relieve the load, especially in the private hospitals who themselves, a lot of people thought, well, the private hospitals would have enough facilities to deal with COVID-19 patients, but they themselves are having challenges themselves. So how does ambulances strike that balance with hospitals to make sure that everyone is catered for during these difficult times?
Sure, I think all, not just limited to private hospitals, but government facilities as well are completely overwhelmed with patients at the moment. Trying to find beds can be an issue. But, to try and avoid these problems and just ensure a better outcome with the patient, when a person calls Netgear 911, our operations center will take down a basic list of details, trying to find out if the patient has any fevers, cough, any of the signs of or symptoms of COVID-19. So our staff will be briefed beforehand. They receive a lot of information electronically. So when the guys will get on scene, they will don PPEs, once again to protect themselves and to protect anyone inside their house and the patient himself. Well, once the patient's been assessed, the guys will then consult with the family doctor, the emergency department, and the hospital to find, a good outcome for the patient, to see where we can take the patient. Obviously, we have to take the patient to the most appropriate facility, and sometimes the closest hospital is not necessarily the most appropriate facility.
Sean, nobody can ever have perfection, and there is something that even the healthcare is trying, but it's going to be severely tested during this COVID-19 pandemic. So what is Netgear 911 doing to kind of improve the healthcare facility within the ambulance to make sure that they can be at the top level when, of course, this peak goes way and way further during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Correct. We are fortunate at Netgear 911 that we can redeploy resources where that's required in what would generally be called a hotspot. So that's one of the situations where we are fortunate that we are able to do that. Obviously, everyone is under strain at the moment. All medical resources have been pushed to their limits. But we have a very good structure in place, very good protocols to assist us in coping with that.
One final question, Sean. Those who are calling Netgear 911, especially during these times where the healthcare has been swamped with COVID-19. What is your advice to any of the viewers listening who have, of course, medical aids and, of course, other services that Netgear 911 does use? What is your advice to everyone at home to make sure that Netgear 911 and the ambulances are not overwhelmed during these times where you need, I won't say space, but just the ability to work efficiently, especially with a lot of patients and a lot of citizens in South Africa contracting COVID-19?
Correct. The biggest thing I can actually ask for is patience when calling. I can understand in an emergency, everyone's worked up. There's a lot of anxiety. People are scared. People are anxious. But all I can ask for is patience when dealing with healthcare workers.
And I think that's going to be very, very important. Sean Herbst is the Netgear 911 national spokesperson, just giving us an idea, of course, of the battles that the frontline workers are currently going through at this moment. We thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Now, it's an absolute pleasure. Well, of course, Sean has just given an idea, and I think what is very, very important is that everyone at home does not go ahead and call them for the minor issues. The major issues are something that these ambulances, of course, would need to deal with. So it is very, very important that we allow ambulances and any sort of frontline workers to be given not just the space, but the efficiency to work well, especially during the time where so many of our hospitals are being flogged with COVID-19 patients. And I think what is going to be important is that we as the citizens play our role. You also heard, of course, in the first half an hour, I had spoken to Mr. Trevor Manuel, who did say that his mother of 94 years of age had contracted COVID-19 and had unfortunately passed away with COVID-19. And of course, Winnie Mandela had contracted COVID-19, but there hasn't been an autopsy released as yet to discuss whether COVID-19 was the cause of the death. But I think the most important fact of what Mr. Trevor Manuel had said is that let's stay safe. President Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, on Sunday did mention that the curfew ends at 9 p.m. So means let's just stay at home, everyone. Let's stay at home. Let's keep safe. Let's try and make sure that we can curb the spread of COVID-19, because that is really going to be the most important factor Today, the Gauteng Provincial Council had just said that the numbers continue to rise in the province, with Gauteng, of course, being the epicenter of the virus. So it's up to us as the citizens to take the initiative and say, let's stay at home, go to places where you need to go, stop the friends visit, stop going to unnecessary people, and just stay at home and try and curb the spread of COVID-19. Of course, certain bans have been enforced. The ban or the re-ban of alcohol has come into the picture, and of course it was necessary to make sure that our healthcare facilities and our hospitals are given the time of not dealing with many trauma cases, and that they can solely focus on helping our citizens during the COVID-19 period. Well, this has been another edition of Truth to Power. In the first half an hour, of course, we spoke to the former Minister of Finance, Mr. Trevor Manuel. And of course, in the last part of the show, we spoke to Sean Herbst, who is, of course, the Netgear 911 national spokesperson. From myself, Herbst Patel, and the rest of the Truth to Power team, stay safe, stay at home, and let's try and fight COVID-19 in the most simplest way. And that is, of course, making sure that you avoid the public places, keep the social distancing, be at home, be with your family. And I think this is the only way we can go ahead and fight this virus. From myself, Herbst Patel, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Have yourself a good afternoon and a fantastic weekend.